Okay, so we're going to be looking at The Most Dangerous Game by Richard Cannell. The thing about The Most Dangerous Game is that it was written during the 1920s, which is a time when a lot of wealthy Americans were actually hunting big game. One of the considered one of the most famous stories in American history, written by Richard Cannell. He's an American author and journalist, but you guys should have read this yesterday. But the idea, the general synopsis of The Most Dangerous Game is that a famous hunter who's written books by the name of Rainsford, he ends up, we'll look at the characters list here, Rainsford ends up going overboard over his ship, who he was also riding with a crew and a shipmate by the name of Whitney, and he ends up going overboard, as I said, and he comes up onto an island. And this island is a little, it's a little strange, you can tell, because he sees a big animal that's dead, and clearly, he heard pistol shots before he even got to the island, so he knows that people are here, potentially food is here. Comes to the house, meets General Zaroff, and then his partner, I guess, is the best thing to call him, Ivan. And then, obviously, as the story goes on, General Zaroff is hunting game that he claims to be more interesting than hunting jaguars and the big game that Rainsford has hunted during his life, I guess. And so he ends up, discovering that Zaroff, hunts people that are captives of his island, and his island is basically naturally kind of built for shipwrecks, and we'll talk about this later. The name of it is Ship Trap Island. And so then, eventually Zaroff tries to hunt Rainsford, and Rainsford ends up outsmarting him. Eventually, it's alluded to the fact that he does end up defeating Zaroff in hand-to-hand combat. But the main takeaway from this story that I hope that you guys can understand is the character development and character analysis. And there aren't a lot of characters in this story, and for a short story, having just around 4 characters is an extremely small number. So the only way for the story to progress is through character development. And the best way to analyze characters is through some literary tools. So just taking a quick look at character development, touching on the different types of characters that are in the story. There is a static character, and a static character is the character that does not change, and a dynamic character, which is a character that does change. And it's pretty obvious which 2 characters those are. Obviously, the static character is General Zaroff. He pretty much holds the same stance on hunting, and we'll talk more about that in themes too, as far as the role that hunting can play in sport and game and murder and or just violence. And and then Rainsford is dynamic because his view kind of changes, and it's not really it's not explicitly said. Actually, yeah, I guess it is. Later in the story, it is explicitly said that he understands a different aspect of the hunter-huntee aspect of hunting that he kind of touched on really early in the story. It's very, very near to the end of the story when he says that he now understood, what it was like to be a beast at bay, which means a beast running for its life. And then there's another aspect to it, is a little bit of wrinkle. It's the foil characters. And foil characters are basically characters whose purpose is to move along the development of the primary characters. You don't get to see them very often. They don't say a lot of things. It's not true for every foil character, but in this story, it's that way. Whitney and Yvonne are the 2 foil characters, because you can read a lot of the way that a character kind of moves through life with the way that he or she interacts with these foil characters. And it's just we'll touch on that a little bit more once we start looking at some specific parts of the story as well. But just jumping right in then to irony. Irony is in this story. To best understand character development in this story, you need to understand irony, and then foreshadowing, and then symbolism. We'll start with irony. Irony is the opposite of what has been spoken. So you're expecting one thing to happen, and the opposite actually happens. And so there's more than one type of irony. It's not all just that. The general perception of irony is the opposite happens of what is expected. But there's verbal irony, which is the intention of the speaker is the opposite of what they're saying, which is basically sarcasm. If somebody is trying to think of an example, if somebody is being outlandish, then you say, "Oh, and I guess the sky is blue too, huh?" And so obviously the sky is blue, but they're emphasizing that somebody is being ridiculous. Situational irony is kind of what I touched on before. It's the more general idea of irony, where the opposite happens from what is expected, and that is more. It's kind of in the name. It's situational. So in specific scenarios, if the opposite happens of what is expected, then that is considered irony. A lot of that is used in the comedy, and there's a lot of irony in comedy, but on specific TV shows, you might see some type of there's a playing up of something specific, and then the opposite happens, and then that's really the punchline of a joke in comedy. But dramatic irony is something that's mostly used in plays, but when the audience knows a piece of information that a character or characters in the story don't know. I don't think there's a lot of dramatic irony in this, unless you picked up on the fact that General Zaroff was hunting humans before Rainsford did. Then that, I guess, could be considered dramatic irony, but we aren't told that information, so so then it's not really considered dramatic irony. And then foreshadowing, things, hints in the story that hint at what's to come later in the story. And we'll touch on that in just a second as well. But then symbolism is when objects have multiple meanings, and usually symbols are like colors, weather, like rain. Rain can often symbolize rebirth of some sorts, or if you're in a storm, it's considered symbolism of terror or treachery. Religion, a lot of marks of religion. If you think of the first mark of religion that a lot of people think of when they think of Christianity is the cross, and then Judaism is the Star of David. Symbols like that. There are some symbols, obviously nothing really religious or anything of that nature, but there is some color and there is some weather, and there are settings and moods that can symbolize other things as well. But we're going to touch on those things throughout the story. So just jumping right into it, looking at the actual text itself, the first thing that jumps out, and it's almost funny, but it's Ship Trap Island. Whitney says that's what this island is that they're passing, and Whitney even says it's a suggestive name, isn't it? Meaning that, ships can get trapped on this island, and then even though the ship doesn't go down or anything like that, it's exactly what happens to Rainsford. But then, just kind of focusing on the character development, the way that I kind of assign colors to these highlights that you're going to see through the text, and we're going to go through these specific sections here in just a second. But the blue is more just like specific characteristics and how stories can characterize the development of characters, how we grow to know the characters as the story moves along. I guess is the best way to say that. But just for an example, and this is immediately an example of a foil character. You remember the foil characters are the characters who are in the story to help further the development of the primary characters. So we learn more about the primary characters through the things that the foil characters say or do within the story. So this quote here, it's highlighted blue because it characterizes Rainsford, but this is very specific to the foil characters I was talking about. The quote is, "I've seen you pick off a moose moving in the brown fall bush at 400 yards, but even you can't see 4 miles or so through a moonless Caribbean night." So not only does this say that they're in the Caribbean, but it also shows through Whitney's observations of Rainsford that Rainsford is very, very good at hunting. He has very good senses, and through that you can pick up the fact that they've been through a lot together. They have a past, and Whitney is very knowledgeable about who Rainsford is. So, kind of moving ahead from there, it's just Whitney and Rainsford on the deck having a conversation, talking about hunting in general, and Rainsford says it's the best sport in the world, and Whitney says for the hunter, not for the jaguar. And then Rainsford, in a very narrow-minded sense, as we're come to know him as, he says, "Who cares how a jaguar feels?" And so this characterizes him as well, but this also plays into some themes that we're going to talk about later on. Who cares how a jaguar feels? And obviously, most people care how a jaguar feels. This is a very pointed quote by Cannell. If you think that he's trying to make a statement about 1920s America and big game hunting, but Rainsford kind of that's where we get a general idea of where Rainsford is coming from when it comes to hunting and violence, and the way that he views hunting from a game standpoint. He clearly feels that hunting as a game is humans are the dominant species in this scenario. So moving ahead, Whitney says perhaps the jaguar does, and then Rainsford comes back and says they have no understanding, and then this is where I talk about before the hunter and huntee. Rainsford says the world is made up of 2 classes, the hunters and the huntees. Luckily, you and I are hunters. And that line is that could honestly be considered foreshadowing, because he is so far on the spectrum towards feeling strongly about being the hunter, and the huntee is extremely the opposite of him, that tension almost needs to be broken later on in the story. At some point in the story, it needs to be broken, and if you catch on that can be considered foreshadowing, and so then they continue talking about how it's dark, and how the Ship Trap Island is not a good place, not a good place to be. There is a mention of Captain Nielsen, and I guess it could be considered characterization to I guess for Rainsford's description of him, or Whitney's description of him, but Captain Nielsen, you don't need to know too much about him. It's pretty much the four characters that we'll be speaking about. But this is also kind of this is an example of irony. When Whitney says one superstitious sailor can taint the whole ship's company with his fear, and then Rainsford comes back and says maybe, but sometimes I think sailors have an extra sense that tells them when they are in danger. And the reason that's irony is because he's saying these things. He's saying that there's there's this extra sense that sailors can have, that tells them that they're in danger. But when it comes to, and we'll see this later on, and we'll allude back to it, but when Rainsford gets onto Ship Trap Island, and Zaroff is kind of hosting him, for a second, Rainsford is kind of taken away by it, and he thinks Zaroff is like a nice guy, and so we'll allude back to this, and I'll point it out when it comes along, but just keep a note of that, and that example of irony. But then eventually it comes up to where he hears 3 gunshots here, and then he gets up on the rail, and then he falls off the boat, and then he ends up swimming toward the island, and it says, Rainsford heard a sound. It came out of darkness, a high screaming sound, the sound of an animal in an extremity of anguish and terror. He did not recognize the animal that made the sound. He did not try to. With fresh vitality, he swam toward the sound. He heard it again, then it was cut short by another noise, crisp staccato. Staccato meaning short, just like a snap. And he says, pistol shot. So clearly he's picking up the fact that there are people on this island. There are guns, but also what the reader can pick up on is that he's going to be part of this. He didn't try to identify the sound. Usually the only animals that are really killed on this island are humans. He doesn't know that. We don't know that yet, but later on in the story we're going to understand that he is going to be part of what he's hearing now, and he doesn't know at this point. But if you read back through the story again, this is one of those passages that stands out as foreshadowing, where we understand, if you read through a second time, we understand what's happening right now, and he doesn't. And so it's a good example of foreshadowing. I want to stop and point that out. But then he ends up getting onto the island, and when he's on the island, he finds, this is an example of symbolism then, he finds an animal, and I believe this was referred to later on as one of the hounds that Zaroff uses to hunt the people playing the game on the third night. And he notices that the weeds were stained crimson, meaning that there was blood. And the symbolism behind that, obviously, there's a lot of connotation that comes with the word blood. It means violence. It means danger. It can mean other things as well. Like if you're talking about Valentine's Day, then that's obviously that's love. But in this scenario, there's no mention of Valentine's Day, and there were gunshots fired shortly before. So crimson is not a good sign, and you will see the color red coming up later on in the story as well. But he moves along, and then there's darkness, and we'll touch on darkness later. And he comes up to, he's noting the terrain. He says it's a mirage. It's not a mirage. And then he comes up to a house, and he meets Yvonne, which he is, I believe it says, is the largest human he's seen, and he's holding a gun to his heart. So very frightening here in the beginning for Rainsford. But then this is where he actually says his name. His name is, I believe that's Sanger Rainsford of New York City. And that's where we actually learn that he's from New York City, he's from America, and then he kind of explains who he is, and Yvonne's not having it, but then Yvonne stops, and he is greeted by General Zaroff. And then in the description of General Zaroff, you can kind of tell, he singularly handsome. I believe he was in evening clothes up here, and it says almost bizarre quality about the general's face. He was tall, past middle age, vivid white hair. He's thin. His mustache was black as the night. His eyes were black. He had a dark face. Just the symbolism behind the darkness. It's a very common theme in stories, but where there's darkness, there's usually terror, terror or unknown. And then just another characteristic says he had the face of an aristocrat, which is basically high class, some type of an official who, you know, makes decisions and things along those lines. So this guy clearly has money. He's in a big house, and you know, we'll note later on that, you know, he clearly has money, and that's usually who hunted big game anyway, so it's not too surprising, but it is a little strange that they're out on Ship Trap Island, and you know, he came upon this island just via, you know, swimming. Kind of feels like he's stranded or in the middle of nowhere, but then there's just like these you know, really fancy kind of trappings around him that he feels, you know, they're a little unusual for the space that he's in, I guess. Then he asks Zaroff if Ivan is Russian, and Zaroff answers he's Kazakh, and what that is an area of southern Russia, around Ukraine. So the general idea, or the general taste for Russia in America in the 1920s is not fantastic. So just understanding kind of when the story takes place, that is another example of you know, some foreshadowing. If a story is being written about this strange man, and he seems like he's from Russia, then, and this from an American writer from, you know, the early 20th century, that's probably not good in the characterization of that person, and especially when it says that he showed his red lips and pointed teeth, red being another symbolism there, going back to the blood on the weeds. And then he says, you know, so am I. So he is also from the same area as Ivan. And then this conversation that they have is really significant here, because then this is where we pick back up on the characterization. And this is, you know, we're about 33% of the way through the story. We're finally getting some ideas of motives of the characters. You know, why is he here? What's he doing? And this is where I noted before that Rainsford was finding him kind of, you know, delightful a little bit. He says he was finding the general a most thoughtful and affable host, a true cosmopolite. So basically, you know, he didn't really realize in the moment that he was in danger. But I think, you know, when it came to the way that Zaroff was talking to Ivan and talking to Rainsford, you know, he was clearly a hunter. He knew things about Rainsford that, you know, Rainsford wasn't expecting anybody to know about him. So he feels a connection between the two. So he doesn't immediately know he's in danger, but he did notice, and this is highlighted in yellow because it kind of shows the motives, that whenever he looked up from his plate and he found the general studying him, appraising him slowly. So basically he was like sizing him up, and you know, he knew of Rainsford. He understood that, you know, where his background was, where he came from, and what he had done. And so, you know, we don't know at the time what exactly he does with people that come on the island, but understanding what he does, this is a very significant observation. And also it does kind of change the mood of the dinner as well, because if somebody just meets you and they're appraising you narrowly, then it usually makes the person being looked at a little uneasy. So then just kind of moving forward through the conversation, he called a Cape buffalo, the largest that Rainsford had ever seen. He has to be charged him. He fractured his skull. But then this is kind of where it starts to take a little bit of a turn, and you can see right here through the red-lipped smile that the smile is not friendly. The smile is definitely dangerous, and that is through the symbolism of red and the way that red has been used in the story. But Rainsford says, I always thought that the Cape buffalo was the most dangerous of all big game. And Zaroff replies, for a moment, or no, he didn't reply this, but this is the observation that Rainsford made. For a moment, the general did not reply. He was smiling his curious red-lipped smile. So understanding what Zaroff does on this island, you really understand why he takes that moment to pause and then smile. You know, it's kind of villainous. And then he says later on, "Here in my preserve on this island," he said, the same slow tone, "I hunt more dangerous game." And so that's just characterized through, you know, this is where we start to learn more about him. And so this is where the conversation really starts to take a turn, and you feel like it's kind of leading towards somewhere. And he says he has the biggest game. And Rainsford said, "Really?" And he said, "Oh, it isn't here naturally, of course. I have to stock the island." And so that kind of characterizes the island. You know, what's there, what happens there. And clearly he, you know, owns the island. So he asks what he's imported, and he doesn't tell him immediately. He just smiles. And, you know, the fact that he's not disclosing this information immediately leaves some mystery. And I think there's some intent here behind Cannell's writing through character development. He doesn't want the reader to know right now what he has on the island and what he does, because you don't understand General Zaroff enough at this point to have that kind of information. It won't register exactly how dangerous Zaroff is if he just tells Rainsford that he's hunting humans on this island. And obviously that's dangerous in itself, but there's a little more depth to this, and this is where the character development becomes really important. He says, "I exhausted their possibilities, you see." He's talking about tigers. "No thrill left in tigers, no real danger. I live for danger, Mr. Rainsford." So whatever's happening on this island is as dangerous as you would have thought would happen on an island called Ship Trap Island, but is becoming a little stranger than just different animals, you know, foreign animals being on this island that he's been stranded on. So then he starts smoking a cigarette, and they continue their conversation, and Rainsford ends up asking again, you know, "But what game?" And he says, "I'll tell you." But he doesn't tell him immediately. He says, "You'll be amused." And then he kind of starts hinting toward it, you know, pours him another glass of port, and then he talks about, you know, how he grew up, and this is why you aren't told immediately that he hunts humans. You know, Cannell wants you to understand more about Zaroff. He wants you to understand that this guy has been killing big game since he was 10 years old. Is when he killed his first bear. He says, "My whole life has been a prolonged hunt." So just adding some depth to the character, a greater understanding of who he is. You know, you can. I mean, it is a very sad situation that somebody's been killing their whole lives, sure. But it's also kind of explaining why he's on this mission, why he's searching for the most dangerous game, and he essentially just gets bored. And he was talking about, you know, hunting in the Rockies, hunting in the Ganges, hunting in East Africa, hunting in the Amazon. He said he just wasn't. He said, "I was lying in my tent with a splitting headache one night when a terrible thought pushed its way into my mind. Hunting was beginning to bore me." And for somebody who is so deeply rooted in hunting, that would obviously be a fearful idea. And so he's pushing himself. He's pushing himself for more challenge, you know, and the best way to do that, and Rainsford and Zaroff are kind of coming to, you know, an understanding here, that the instinct is no match for reason. Basically, that's the point that Zaroff is trying to make through this, and you can tell he's kind of been crafting this explanation for people that come upon the island. He doesn't just tell them, "Hey, you're part of this game now. go run and I'm going to hunt you. You know, he doesn't say that. He explains very specifically, and especially to Rainsford, because Rainsford, you know, is a very respected hunter, that, you know, he realized that instinct is no match for reason. And basically, what he means by that is that animals rely on their instinct, and humans have more reason. And that, you know, he mentions courage, and fear in different aspects of human nature that aren't there in other animals. So he said he had to invent a new animal to hunt, and that's when Rainsford realized, well, animals only have instinct, humans have reason, so the only animal that he could hunt would be humans. And he still doesn't really understand it for a while. It's coming, and this is kind of back to the idea of the sixth sense. You know, they can understand whether they're in fear or not, and he's not really getting it immediately. So we're just furthering this highlighted in yellow because this is highlighted in yellow because it's furthering his motive. We're getting closer to his ultimate motive in the story, and we're about halfway through the story at this point, and he still hasn't said it. And again, that is because Cannell wants to reveal this information when he believes the reader fully understands Zaroff and fully understands Rainsford. And so then they further the conversation, and this is when he figures it out. Zaroff says, "But no animal can reason," objected Rainsford. "My dear fellow," said the general, "there is one that can." And so this gets into the idea of theme, and we can talk about this a little bit later too, but this is the moment where we really start to grapple with the idea of animals versus humans. And, you know, are humans animals? Do animals have reason? Things along those lines. So when he says there is one that can, in response to Rainsford saying, "But no animal can reason," clearly Rainsford wasn't thinking that Zaroff was hunting humans, you know, and so that's kind of why he didn't really come to that conclusion immediately. But then he realizes here, "But you can't mean," gasped Rainsford. So he understands then that what it is that he's doing is hunting humans. And so then, you know, at this point, and this is going to be important as well, where Zaroff says, "I refuse to believe that so modern and civilized a young man as you seem to be harbors romantic ideas about the value of human life. Surely your experience in the war." And so basically what he was hinting at was, you know, you've had hand-to-hand combat with other humans, you know, you've done something like this before, but clearly, you know, war can sometimes be a little more nuanced than that. And so it's not just, you know, it's not just, you know, man to man. It's all, there are a lot of other aspects to it. And so Rainsford replies, "Did not make me condone cold-blooded murder." So clearly he doesn't, you know, he doesn't harbor a lot of positivity for what he did during the war, but he still hunts big game, which he can separate from hunting humans. And Rainsford, or Zaroff, clearly does not hold the same sentiment. He also served in war, and he is continuing to search for the most dangerous game, he says. So you know, then he continues to say, you know, this is murder, and he asks where he gets them, and we've already talked about this, but then, you know, it really starts to peak here. They're still having the conversation, and it's clear that Rainsford just really isn't understanding that he is part of this too. he was shipwrecked on this island. Even though he went overboard and swam to the island, he is essentially a captive, and he will be part of this. And so the reader, it's not told to the reader exactly, but the reader is slowly coming to the same conclusion. And so when it says that Zaroff dropped a walnut on the hardwood floor and brought his heel grinding down on it, that's a context clue to show that, this isn't going to end well for Rainsford. He is going to be part of this. And so then this is just more characterization on how the whole game works, and he mentions that there's three knights. He's given food, he's given a knife, 3 hours head start, things like that, and then Zaroff goes after him, and if he survives, then he wins, and if he doesn't, then obviously he loses. And then he did mention that one almost did win, but then he had to use the dogs, and this is where we find out that he has hounds, and then that's the animal that Rainsford found when he came up onto the island. And so then this is kind of where some irony comes into the story on Rainsford's end, because remember, he was talking about nobody cares about a jaguar's feelings. Nobody cares about the animal that's being hunted, because they only have instinct. They don't have reason. They don't feel the same things that humans do. That is Rainsford's rationalization for what he does. And so when the part of the passage comes up where it says Rainsford could not quiet his brain with the opiate of sleep, he lay eyes wide open. Once he thought he heard stealthy steps in the corridor outside his room. So he's clearly feeling some paranoia, and the reader starts to finally realize, he is becoming the huntee. He's feeling fear, and for Rainsford having said before that and the huntees don't feel fear. They don't feel fear of pain and fear of death, like Whitney had said earlier in the story. He's feeling quite a bit of fear for being a huntee, and so that's where the irony comes into play there. But then this is just more characterization on exactly what he does. This is when Zaroff becomes the most sadistic, when he's talking about how this the guy that he hunted on the night before, when Rainsford heard gunshots in the dark, he said he offered no problems, and that sailors were kind of dull brains to begin with, so they couldn't really understand how to fight in the woods, or how to escape in the woods, or hunt. And so then, he's obviously killed a human being the night before, but then he says, "Would you have another glass of Chablis, Mr. Rainsford?" Right after he explains, he's casually explaining the fact that sailors, that he just killed a sailor last night. So that is when we get the understanding of, exactly how violent and where he stands, and how he rationalizes what he does in hunting the most dangerous game. And so this is when he starts to, they give some more understanding of, the fact that Rainsford is going to be on the run from Zaroff shortly in the story. And then Zaroff, and then this is just further characterization of how Zaroff views it. He views it as outdoors chess, with a lot of value, with a lot of value in the stakes. And he kind of looks forward to this challenge, even though it's murder, as Rainsford said. But then he goes out, and he goes out into the jungle, and this is where further irony comes into play, and this is actually where a metaphor comes into play. where he talks about, you know, I've played the fox, and I almost played the cat of the fable. He's referring to the cunningness of the fox, and now you know, hiding with the cat. Further, you know, drawing. There are a lot of metaphors in this regard where he starts to be compared to animals, even though, you know, he very strongly drew a line between himself and the animals he hunted. Now, as he's out, you know, being hunted, he's being compared to animals, and I think that's a really important comparison to draw as he is being hunted, because he's feeling the things that he didn't think animals felt, and I think that is something that Cannell intentionally did, but it continues on, and then he saw Zaroff. He made this trail that he never thought Zaroff would be able to track, and then Zaroff, you know, we think that he doesn't see Rainsford, but then it says he very deliberately blew a smoke ring into the air. So clearly, you know, he did see him. He blew a smoke ring up in the air to let him know that he's just toying with him. He doesn't want the game to end yet. And further characterization of Zaroff. But then here's more irony. You know, the Cossack was the cat, he was the mouse. Just comparing him to a mouse. And even in that regard, it's strange of Rainsford to compare Zaroff to a cat, even, because that's an animal, and clearly there was a line drawn between the hunter and animals, you know. So just further comparison there, and then and he keeps telling himself, you know, I will not lose my nerve, and so he's trying to fight the idea of the hunty that he always had when he hunted, and he's trying to maintain his humanity and what he's saying. So then he continues on. He doesn't catch him on the second day either, though he gets close. Zaroff was hit by a trap that Rainsford had set. And then he compares himself again to a huge prehistoric beaver as he's digging this trap, and the trap ends up, you know, catching a hound. It doesn't actually catch Zaroff, and so then he sets up another trap, and then once that trap hits Yvonne, it doesn't hit Zaroff, then he's still running from the hounds. And this is where, you know, we've been seeing a lot of comparisons between Rainsford and animals as he's been on the run, and you know, further separating himself from the idea. This is the line right here that I mentioned earlier, where Rainsford becomes a dynamic character. You know, there needs to be change made in the characters. There's not a lot of change made between the Zaroff that we met in the beginning and the Zaroff that we know at the end. But this line, Rainsford knew now how an animal at bay feels. You know, this is the change that we see from the Rainsford that showed up on the island before he before he went overboard, when he was talking to Whitney, saying that who cares how a jaguar feels. This is the change that we needed to see to understand, you know, Rainsford is going to go through some changes by being the hunted, by being the hunty. He can now empathize with the animals that he hunts. You know, whether or not that makes a difference, or whether or not that makes a difference in the way that he continues on in his life isn't told to the reader, but we still know that in this moment he can put himself in the shoes of that jaguar in the beginning. And so that's where the irony comes in. This is where the irony hits. The irony is that in the beginning he said, who cares how a jaguar feels? And at the end, he is that jaguar. and it's just an extended metaphor. And so he is that jaguar, and he clearly cares about his his self-preservation and the way and his health, and he clearly cares about the way he's feeling in that moment. And so there's a change there, and that's why he is a dynamic character. But then he, okay, yeah, this is where he catches Yvonne with his final trap, and then he goes back. Zaroff goes back to his room, and he has dinner, and he retires to his room, and then that's where he finds Rainsford in his room. Rainsford had gone over a cliff. He swam back to the house. Obviously, Yvonne's not there for security, so he could go right in, and then obviously they square it up, and this is kind of another characterization. I mean, we're getting characterization all the way until the end here, but even when Zaroff is kind of caught in his room and it's mano a mano, he still treats it as a game. His last words that we hear from him are "on guard, Rainsford." Whoever wins this fight is going to live. And then at the end, Rainsford had never slept in a better bed. So just kind of through the characterization, we can see how the symbolism plays into all of this. With the red, with the dark especially coming in when it comes to Zaroff and characterizing Zaroff. The red comes in characterizing the island, and so then you have foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is less characterization, more plot, but also you can see some things like we talked about before, where who cares about the tiger's feelings? That is 100% foreshadowing for the change that is about to come at the end of the story, and just a few nights later. So foreshadowing also must be understood when you're talking about character development. But then looking at themes, then reason versus instinct. We've touched on a number of these already, but this is the major difference between Rainsford and Zaroff is the reason versus the instinct, and the way that they view those two things. So it kind of ties into the next thing as well, with murder versus sport versus violence, and I think that's probably the more layered one of the two. But reason versus instinct is clearly the reason being with humans, and instinct being with animals that are hunted, and those two switching places. And so, and then murder versus sport versus violence is where whose stance on hunting is the correct stance, and it's really tough to find a right answer to that one. There are a lot of different answers to that, but when talking about hunting, is it to Rainsford it's sport, right? And then to Zaroff it's also sport, but it crosses this line. When does hunting cross the line between sport and murder, and what justifies that violence? And in the end, is it just violence, or is it also a game? And so that's the line that Cannell is trying to walk between Rainsford and Zaroff, and making the message that he's trying to convey with the idea of the big game hunting in the 1920s. So he ties in animal versus human, which is a lot of the same as reason versus instinct, but also is more of identity. What is animal, what is human, when do humans become animals, when do animals become human? And then fear ties into these other themes as well, reason versus instinct. And we saw the fear from Rainsford as well when he was being hunted. So a lot of overlapping themes in this story. a lot of in-depth themes as well. But the assignment after this one, just real quick, and just write an essay for tomorrow, at least 500 words, addressing the following 2 points. The first one: what are Rainsford and General Zaroff's stances on hunting as a sport and hunting as murder? And how are the characters the same, and how are they different? And a lot of this can be drawn through the themes that we just talked about, but a lot of it can be drawn between the symbolism, the irony, and the foreshadowing that we mentioned throughout the story before. And then the second point is what are your thoughts on hunting? The man versus nature, the reason versus instinct, the violence, etc. Just all the different themes, character development, the different things that we have talked about in this story, and what are your stances on those things that are addressed in this short story? And then we will talk about that again tomorrow. But I wanted to touch on the significance of character development in this story specifically, and hopefully you can carry that into your writing assignments. But let me know if you have any questions, and then we can talk about some other aspects of the story as well, and then we'll move on to this assignment, and then we'll talk again tomorrow.